Good day, ladies and gentlemen. We're here with a fascinating discussion with our friend Dr. Ed Mazza. For some reason, Ed, I like to say Dr. Mazza. I don't know. I've heard you say that before. We're going to talk about a interesting, fascinating, controversial, touchy, sensitive topic, sort of the issue of Archbishop Viganò, the accusations of excommunication, schism, and so forth. And we're going to discuss a variety of reasons why it may or may not be valid, depending on certain theological opinions that are strong. And before we get going, just so everybody knows, I understand this is something that people have strong opinions on. And this time in the church is very confusing. When Pope Francis recently had his recent blunder, one of millions of them, and, talking about basically religious indifferentism and so forth, and all paths lead to God. I did a show on that about the reality of no salvation outside the Catholic Church. And I said to my good Sede friends on the internet, and I mean that because I do have lots of good Sedevacantist friends. And I said, guys, I know you're drooling right now. I know you're chomping at the bit you're like a dog full of a bowl of fresh meat. This is like your moment. And I said, but you got to be better salesmen than you usually have been, and to do it with some like fraternal charity. And that's something that I recommend to everybody about these disputed questions, because, we got a lot of things going on right now, Ed, that we're probably going to have to wait for some sort of ecumenical council or something in the future in a time of health in the church to really clear a lot of stuff up. Pope Francis may be an anti-pope. He may be anathematized like Pope Honorius or something like that. I mean, that sort of thing may happen. And you know more about this than I do as a church historian. So just, it's a conversation, because the more you know, the better. And people know my position. I am not a Sedevacantist. I'm not saying Dr. Ed is. I'm just saying some of the information may lead to some of those conclusions. I'm not. But at the same time, I don't think Sedes are schismatics. I've said that many times, because to me, it seems that to be a Sedevacantist is to have an opinion about the papacy, that a particular pope is invalid or lost the office or whatever. That's not a rejection of the papacy as such. It's a decision made about a confusing affair in a confusing time, and I don't fault anyone for it. So I try to keep the lines of communication open. Does that make sense, Ed?
A lot of sense.
Okay, perfect. So let's get into it. Before we continue, though, your website is it edmundmazza.org?
.com.
edmundmazza.com. I will put the link for that in the description. You do have some courses that are coming up. Do you want to tell us about those quick?
Yes, we just started a course, Mary More Awesome Than Armies, talking about the great battles that the victory was attributed to Our Lady, or the saving John Paul from assassination on the Fatima anniversary, May 13th, 1981. We've got another course we just started, Super Heretics versus Super Saints, talking about the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation. And this November, we're going to have a class on the ancient world. So
Wow.
Everything from the 300 to Anthony and Cleopatra to King David to gladiators. It's all there.
That's awesome. My children, we homeschool, and we have this audio series called The Story of the World. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. It's a wonderful homeschooling resource. You can also use it for other things, but we listen to them on long car drives. And my son, it's like it looks like he's not paying attention, and then he just rattles off all these names of ancient emperors and all these kinds of things. And mom's like,
Yeah.
I don't even remember those things. He's really, so this is fun stuff. So check out edmundmazza.com, and the link for that is in the description. Ed is at his best when it comes to church history. That's his speciality. So you're in for a treat if you sign up. All right. Where should we begin?
Well, Archbishop Viganò was, they say excommunicated, but the Vatican said that he was excommunicated automatically, right? Late sententiae. And I've got some quotes from some pretty holy and smart people that would kind of dispute that. So
Okay.
if you want, we can just jump into that.
Sure. Do you want to break down the different types of excommunication so people have a context for what late sententia means?
Sure. So as I understand it, and I'm not a canonist, although I did do the definitive book in English on St. Raymond of Peñafort, who codified canon law, which lasted until 1917. But anyway, late sententiae means that it's an automatic excommunication. You did X, and X means that you're excommunicated. Then, of course, there's other situations where it's not automatic, and where anyway, so that at the simplest level, that's the simplest explanation.
Right. So I've talked about this with Archbishop Lefebvre, for example, because that is the accusation of a lete sententia, by the act itself is what it means, versus ferende sententiae, which essentially means because of a particular act, the relative or the appropriate jurisdiction has decided that for a special reason you've excommunicated yourself. So basically it's like one is you've done something that automatically has with it the penalty, whereas others, because of an egregious action, they can decide to as a remedial penalty for the penitent. That's kind of the distinction as I understand it.
Right, yeah.
Okay, great. Do you want me to bring up the slides?
Sure.
Okay, let's do that.
All right, so this first quote is from Cardinal Thomas Cajetan, not to be confused with Saint Cajetan, who actually lived during the same time period. But Cajetan was a Thomist, and he actually knew a thing or two about schism because he debated Martin Luther, of all people. And in his commentary on St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae, and specifically in the section on schism, this is his take. And he says, if someone, for a reasonable motive, holds the person of the Pope in suspicion and refuses his presence, even his jurisdiction, he does not commit the delict of schism nor any other whatsoever, provided that he be ready to accept the Pope were he not held in suspicion. End of quote. That seems pretty straightforward to me. I don't know what your take is, Ken.
It does. I mean, I've been saying this. I've talked about the Viganò thing maybe a couple times since it happened, but it's not really my concentration right now is mainly the charismatic renewal. I'm writing a book on that and stuff. So my efforts have been there. But one of the things I've benefited from studying the life of Archbishop Lefebvre so much and having to delve into all those questions is that something that has been lost in the church, in the sense of not the indefectible part of the church, but in the sense of the theological discussions and opinions and so forth. One of the things that's lost is an understanding that there is an interior forum for all sin. And this is something that's very clear in the law. When you have, and our legal systems are based on the inherited common law systems of our Christian ancestors, where they would apply the principles of sound morality to legal matters. And when you talk to lawyers, they'll talk about a mens rea and an actus reus. So you have your guilty mind and your guilty action. So an easy example is you shoot somebody. It's murder if you intentionally wanted to kill a person for a reason of malice, etc. It is not murder when you did it in self-defense. The action is the same. The result is the same. The intention is different. And this is how mortal sin works. The three prongs of mortal sin. You have to know what you're doing. You have to want to do it, and you have to do it, with free will. And so these things, we've become so legalist, in my opinion, Dr. Mazza, in the church. I think that's a real plague right now, is a Pharisaical legalism. And so people say, well, listen, it's in a document. It must be true. It's like, well, hold on. The accusation is a sin because schism is a sin. So we need to be sure that the person has committed a sin for all that entails. Does that make sense?
That does, and I would agree with you in the case of Archbishop Lefebvre, and I would agree with you, I would postulate in the case of Archbishop Viganò. But maybe later in the show, we'll talk about the fact that certain theologians, everybody from Karl Rahner to Ludwig Ott, have said that if you are a heretic, materially speaking, but not formally speaking, so you're not guilty of sin, you still cannot hold office in the Catholic Church. And therefore a pope who was merely a material, and it has to be a public material heretic.
Okay.
But a pope who was a public material heretic would cease to be pope ipso facto, excuse me, even though he was not subjectively guilty. And I've got multiple people who affirm that, as I say, everybody from Karl Rahner to Ludwig Ott. But so that's a little different than the example that we just talked about with Archbishop Lefebvre or Viganò.
All right, well, let's get on to the next slide then.
Sure. The next slide is like the first one. A lot of people, especially in Sede circles, will be familiar with the work of Fathers Werns and Vidal, who did their work back at the beginning of the 20th century. Their commentary on the 1917 Code of Canon Law is considered the most respected commentary on the 1917 Code, which we call it the 1917 Code, but it lasted until 1982. So, and they say on this specific point, they cannot be numbered among the schismatics who refuse to obey the Roman pontiff because they consider him suspect, there's that word again, or doubtfully elected on account of rumors in circulation. Now, I asked a prominent canon lawyer, I won't give out his name, and I asked him, well, what is your take on this? I said, do you know of any author coming after Werns and Vidal who disputes their position on this? And we can bring up what he said to me. Actually, I have a quote here. He said to me, no, but I have not read widely on that question. Still, Werns and Vidal enjoy such high regard and are of unquestioned orthodoxy. So I can't imagine anyone who would have wanted to contest them on this. So that is, it seems to me, pretty solid.
Well, it makes sense to me, though. Like, again, people have debates on, again, it even says rumors. That's the thing that's interesting about it. Because
the bar is not set very high.
No, the bar is not set very high. And we do have precedent for this. And, Dr. Kwasniewski did one of his, I love his work, and one of his talks, he's given so many talks and they always become chapters in his books. But he's very smart that way. I've learned a lot from him. His articles become his books. And I said, you're repurposing your work there. It's a smart thing to do. But he, one of his talks, I think it was on obedience. It might have been. But anyway, he talked about how what's interesting about when you're in a crisis in the church is that there are things that are very familiar about it, meaning that there are crises in the past that have similarities, but then there are things that are also very new about it. And during that whirlwind, during that tempest of confusion, there are a variety of opinions of many saints and men of goodwill that differ from others from the time. And many of them with differing opinions are remembered as saints. Because it can't be held against someone for having a opinion that turns out to not be the majority opinion or the consensus opinion when it hasn't been codified or established in any sort of stamped it, locked it, can't erase it kind of way, because that would be unfair. And so it's interesting, when we look to our crisis in the church and we say, man, it's a lot like the Aryan crisis, and it is a lot like the Aryan crisis in some ways. It's also very different because it seems to be more elusive and internal and less explicit and more almost psychological, pitting modernism against Aryanism. And it's very hard for people. So yeah, I think that's a important way to look at it.
Definitely. And it's not even just the objective thing, it's the subjective thing. For example, people are arguing within the stratosphere, not simply, is Viganò right here, or Cajetan and Fathers Werns and Vidal, but even if he was objectively right, that Francis is not Pope, are you allowed as a layperson to make that determination and speak about it? There are various people who are critical of his position. Recently, Dr. Fazer, I believe on X or Twitter, said that lay people, any person, does not have the right to judge who the Pope is. And I've heard other people opine in the same way, and I respectfully disagree with them. And the prominent example I bring up is Saint Catherine of Siena.
Yes.
And I've got a quote to that effect if we want to talk about that or bring that up. In the fall of, I guess it was 1379 or 78, she wrote to the cardinals, and the entire College of Cardinals had recognized Cardinal Robert of Geneva as the Pope, even though the real Pope was still sitting in Rome.
Hmm.
And she wrote to the Italian cardinals, and she said, look, I tell you that you cardinals did wrong with the antipope. He was chosen a member of the devil. You have committed all these faults in regard to this devil, to confess him as pope, which he surely is not. She didn't mince words. Tell me what you really think, St. Catherine, right?
Dr. Mazza, she sounds so much like a schismatic there. What's wrong with her? What is she, some sort of rad trad on the internet? No, that's just too funny.
Exactly.
Well, yeah, and also I would agree with that because I can't remember the work. There's a Sedevacanist friend of mine, and in the world of Sedevacantism, there are lots of different streams. Some of them are much more easy to talk to than others. I'm trying to be nice, and the guys that I find the most reasonable are the fellas who follow sort of the John Lane kind of world of Sedevacantism, and a friend of mine. He has a website called the WM Review, which I find to be a pretty good website. And it's not all about Sedevacantism. A lot of it's just about great theology. It's just, honestly, they're just good scholars, and I really like those guys. And they had an article, and I included it in my modernism book that I just submitted to Sophia. And it was one of the commentators on, there's all these, these commentators on theological manuals and things. And I had I can't remember who it was, some Italian name. But he was talking about about heretics. So people will always say, well, you don't have the right to call anybody a heretic or say that someone's a heretic. And it was actually, that's not true at all. No. And it was very clear. It was very clear in this theological manual that, to put it in layman's terms, you have a brain, you have eyes, you can read, you can think, and you can say, this statement is Catholic, this statement's not Catholic, you said the one that's not. That's heresy, where I think that some people confuse the, I think when statements about lay people not being able to make those judgments, I think that they're confusing that a lay person doesn't have the right to, let's say, make another person beholden to an opinion, or, I don't have an authority over someone, but you can make that judgment because it's really just a matter of the intellect.
Yeah, it's like here in the United States, I could make a judgment on whether President Nixon or President Clinton was, guilty and should be impeached, right, or convicted of impeachment. But it's not up to me. It's it's the U.S. Congress, the House of Representatives does the charge, and then the Senate convicts or doesn't convict. So it's sort of like that.
No, that makes sense.
Right.
Yeah.
So yes, and I know that website that you're talking about. I've seen a lot of good stuff on there, and I actually once got in trouble with Michael Lofton.
Of course you did. That's so have I 1,000 times. Yeah,
that's how you earn your stripes in this business, right? And he accused me of, well, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but he sort of said I was advancing Sede arguments when I was on with Timothy Gordon, and I brought up the example, germane to what you just said, of Eusebius, not the bishop Eusebius or the historian Eusebius, but Eusebius, who was a lawyer at the court at Constantinople at the time right before the Council of Ephesus. Bishop Nestorius was the patriarch of Constantinople, and he, in a very infamous sermon, he said that Mary is not the Theotokos. Mary's not the mother of God. And this layperson stood up in Hagia Sophia and said, that's heresy. And then he didn't stop there. People don't know this, but I've looked into this. He actually started putting placards and signs all over Constantinople, and comparing the heretical teachings of Nestorius with the heretical teachings of a guy who lived a few decades earlier, who was convicted as a heretic. And he wrote a defense. I mean, he wrote an accusation against Nestorius. Now, he did all these things as a layperson without sanction, so to speak. But in a letter that Pope Celestine subsequently wrote to, among other people, Nestorius, I won't go into the details here, but unless people want me to, but basically, Pope Celestine basically did not sanction anything that Eusebius had done. Rather, his language makes it look like Eusebius did right. And in fact, later on, Eusebius was a main protagonist against the Monophysites and became a bishop. So there's an example, a prominent example of a layperson taking it upon himself to call out his own bishop, archbishop, patriarch, when the faith was in danger.
Yeah, and even in the current Code of Canon Law 212, it's a pretty broad permission, but that's kind of the point, is that it's kind of a broad permission in the sense of you can make your needs known to the pastors of the church, And I've obviously been accused of 1,000 different things, and I remember, and only some of them are true. I'm just kidding, but and I remember one conversation I was having with an individual who was very anti-Society of St. Pius X. We were having a text conversation in a group chat. And he was basically saying, you're a meanie poo-poo head. You're a big jerk because, you haven't gone through the proper channels and blah, blah, blah. And I said, actually, not that I need to tell you this, but I'm going to because you're accusing me of something. I've actually had a variety of conversations, both telephone, email, and in person with the hierarchy in my diocese. I need to give details, but I've sat down at one point with the vicar of the diocese on the question of the SSPX and had an almost 2-hour conversation with the priest and the theologians present, just because I was called in to do that because they were worried about my spreading of SSPX material. And I said, so I actually have done that. But the point is that I wasn't required to either. I was just, these are the Society of St. Pius X or any other issue. It's not a diocesan matter. It's not a sense. I'm not questioning the, let's say the disciplinary, particularities of what is allowed during Lent on a Friday because it happens to be St. Joseph's feast day and it's on a Friday and our diocesan bishop says you can have meat that day. I'm not going on a podcast and saying he can't do that. Well, technically he can do that. That's not my point. The point is I'm talking about something that pertains to the Catholic doctrine, to the history of the church and so forth. And I can talk about it like anybody, but yes, I have gone through the channels. But the point is that you as a layperson, you can talk about this stuff. And it's been the case, before there were podcasts, there were placards with Eusebius. And this is just a different medium that we're doing something that's happened before.
And since you bring up the SSPX, I've got a very interesting quote from none other than Archbishop Lefebvre himself, if you want to.
Sure.
Yeah. So he says, some priests say that we need not worry about what is happening in the Vatican. We have the true sacraments, the true Mass, the true doctrine. So why worry whether the Pope is a heretic or an impostor or whatever? It is of no importance to us. But I think that is not true. If any man is important in the church, it is the Pope. He is the center of the church and has a great influence on all Catholics by his attitudes, his words, and his acts. All men read in the newspapers the Pope's words, and on television, many Catholics are losing the faith by the scandal of the Pope's partaking in all religions. There you go.
Yeah, it's actually, a lot of people say the SSPX sort of forbids conversation about the papacy. It's not true. That's kind of a... Prudentially speaking, it's just not something that they sort of preach on, just whatever. It's one of those things where it's like, well, we can't do anything about it per se, so we'll just sort of make sure we catechize and bring the faith and so forth. But there is no one is forbidden from having doubts. Let's put it that way, because it's just a matter of assessing the facts at hand.
And the situation is so unprecedented. Our people who say we should shut up, they are right on the point that there is no procedure in canon law, the way there's a procedure in the American Constitution, for the removal of a pope.
Yeah.
So there's no canons for that. But that doesn't mean that you and I can't talk about what the theologians and the canonists have had to say on the subject about the possibility of a heretic pope or not.
Have you read Dr. K's, he is the editor, but it was Ultramontanism and Tradition. Have you read that book?
No, not yet. But
it's a very good book.
I do know of it. Mm-hmm.
Very good book. John Lamont has a couple of really interesting essays in there. And a Dominican friar. He's a priest that has to remain anonymous. and he has some good essays about the. He actually outlines the question of sedevacante from the first 1,000 years of the church, which is interesting because it's something that's usually talked about in the sort of post-Tridentine era
Yes.
with more of the Bellarminian kind of perspective. And it's just interesting to see the contrast. But nonetheless, John Lamont had an interesting essay about Pope Francis's public heretic. And it also appeared at Rorate Cele. So you may have read it at some point. It was included in this book as well.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And what was interesting is he said it definitely seems that there's a consensus amongst the canonists, meaning those who have sort of a right to an opinion in the ecclesiastical sense, that a heretic pope would lose his office or not be properly elected or whatever the case may be. But it's also the case that there's a consensus that no one really knows what to do with that. And I think that's really the difficulty about what we're living through.
Yes. We have certain precedents, but what's the Mark Twain line? History doesn't
repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I like the fact that you brought up the first 1,000 years, because again, people normally think of St. Robert Bellarmine, Cajetan, and these guys. I've got a quick example from the first 1,000 years. I have a quote from St. Columban, who
great
lived
Irish
during
saint.
the 600.
Yeah.
Exactly. I'm half Irish and half Italian, so I take great pride in reading this here. This is a letter that he actually wrote to the Pope at the time.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, the devil doesn't like conversations like this, so we just had a tech error. So this is why you're seeing this sort of cut and pasted here. We recorded like 20 minutes. It was the best 20 minutes you're never going to see. G.K. Chesterton said his best book was like all the books he'd never written. You know, it was the best book. His best book was the one he never wrote. The best podcast is the one you're never going to see. So we actually lost about 20 minutes, but we're just on the cusp here, Dr. Mazza, of doing the St. Columban quote. Do you want to bring up the St. Columban again, and I'll bring back that up here?
Yes. This is St. Columban in the 6th century talking to a pope as a layperson. Well, yeah, I guess was he a priest or anyway, I have to go double check that. Anyway, I summon you. Remove the cloud of suspicion from St. Peter's chair. Call a conference so that you may clear the charges laid against you. For you are alleged to favor heretics. God forbid men should believe that this has been, is, or shall be true. Already it is your fault if you have erred from the true belief. Justly do your subordinates oppose you, and justly do they hold no communion with you. He's saying this to a pope, okay? For if these things are rather true than fabled, with changed roles your sons are turned into the head, while you become the tail. Thus too shall they be your judges. And this is actually a quote from Scripture. Who have always kept the Orthodox faith, even if they seem to be your subordinates. But they themselves are the Orthodox and true Catholics, since they have never favored or supported James Martin or other suspect persons, but have remained in eager love for the true faith, unquote. As my Irish mother would say, Lord rest her soul, put that in your pipe and smoke it.
Well, it's interesting. I just pulled up the biography or the Wikipedia entry of St. Columban just to see. And what's interesting, because people love to point to these ancient saints talking about obedience as a way to own the trads, and his rule of life talked about unreserved obedience for those who take the rule. But obviously he understood in context that meant for those who had made that particular vow for the reasons of making that vow, their spiritual life and whatever. And that's obviously important. But here we see him saying, hey man, there's a problem and you're gonna have to do something about it. And somebody has to speak out about it. And it's really the most important thing is the faith above all.
Exactly. And to that end, we should not be silenced when we're just doing what other people. I mean, I can't put myself in the same category as St. Columban, other than the fact that I am Irish. But why should we be faulted for acting in the same manner or using the same vocabulary, right, as these people did? And yeah.
Well, so it's funny. I'm Hall English on my dad's side, 100% Anglo blood, whatever, came to Canada, I don't know, 120 years ago or something. My mom's side, she's a relatively recent Italian immigrant. She came over when she was like 11. And but I found out, so I was in Ireland recently, and when you're in Ireland, you really want to be Irish because the Irish are awesome. And I bet you half of Canada's population has some Irish in their blood because of all the immigrants.
Yeah.
And I don't. And I'm like, this is annoying. My wife does. I know she's like her dad is a quarter or something, and his grandfather was Irish, and I'm thinking I'm the only one here. I'm missing out. I want some Kilkenny is the North American version of Smithwick's essentially, and Kilkenny Smithwick's, those are my favorite ales. Writer's Tears is my favorite whiskey. Close second is Jameson. I love me the Irish drink, and I love rugby, and my favorite team is Leinster, weirdly enough, just because there's no professional teams in Canada, so I just picked a good team, and it happened to be them when I started watching rugby years ago. And but then they told me, they said, the Scots are actually Irish, and they have this whole history for why, and the Scots are going to get mad at that, but they say that they're actually Irish. And I said, well, actually, the name Hall does come from Scotland. So if you try hard enough, everyone can be Irish. That's what I found out.
There's only two kind of people in the world: those that are Irish and those that wish they were.
Perfect. All right, what's our next quotation here?
Yes, St. Thomas Aquinas, the angelic doctor. Now, this is to answer those people who think that it's wrong of us to question anything that the Pope, or the putative Pope, says or does. Okay.
Yeah.
No man ought to despise or in any way injure another man without urgent cause, unless we have evident indications of a person's wickedness. We ought to deem him good by interpreting for the best whatever is doubtful about him. And I think it's an undeniable fact that there are many doubtful things about the man in Rome. And I, for one, am persuaded of the person's wickedness.
Yeah.
And therefore, it seems to me he has lost the benefit of the doubt a long time ago.
That's true. Again, it comes back to the fact that lay people, you have to use your reason. You have to, I think what's happened since the council, this is this is me being a playing psychologist. And Dr. K talks about this in one of his books about Sunday obligation. And, as an SSPX guy, I have been saying, for reasons that I believe, not just because the SSPX says it, but because I read the literature and I think it makes sense. And you're not required to go to a liturgy that you believe is dangerous to your faith and so forth. People will say, oh, Kennedy, you're such a schismatic and you always have to go no matter who's celebrating mass, and it's a mortal sin not to go on Sunday and blah, 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 blah. And I said, I get it. I get what you're saying, but I think there's more to it than that. And lo and behold, Dr. K writes in his book, Bound by Truth, he finds all of these theological manuals before the council talking about how there were, it's funny, the exceptions, because the world was so different. And these writers from obviously Europe and the United Kingdom and Ireland and stuff, they're talking about, if it's lambing season, because we all have a lot to do during lambing season, of course. If it's lambing season and there's a good chance to make, a significant portion of your income at the local fair, you can miss mass for 2 or 3 weeks. Or, if you're in the first or the third trimester of pregnancy, women are not required to go. And I'm joking. I'm thinking, my goodness, these trad ladies are not going to go to mass for about, out of 20 years, they're not going to go for 10 of them, or if they're nursing, or just lots of different things, but then Dr. K says, since the council, we lost everything. We lost all the things, and all we could hold on to was basically, Sunday obligation and like the pro-life position or something like that, or the validity of the mass, so kind of like people kind of lost the perspective of being able to look at the thing as a whole and think for themselves. They stopped thinking. I think this quote from Thomas Aquinas shows how it's okay for you to think for yourself. If God didn't want you to think for yourself within bounds, obviously, of orthodoxy, but if he didn't want you to think for yourself, he wouldn't have given you free will. And I think people kind of forget that part.
Exactly. We're endowed with an intellect and free will. And I believe the quote is from that famous book that Tan published, Liberalism is a Sin. There's a good, I think the quote I'm talking about. There's a quote in there where the father who wrote the book talks about the fact that we can apply the rule of faith. Like, we don't have to for every single thing that we do, we don't have to go run ask a priest first, right? It's that concept, right? The idea that it's our nature that we are, intellect, we bodies with intellects and will, and so we call it like we see it, right?
Yeah, yeah,
I
exactly.
mean, I could even give you a good quote from St. Robert Bellarmine, Doctor of the Church. Let's see if I can pull it up, because it captures what we're talking about right now. Here we go. So back in the 300s, there was the Aryan crisis, obviously, and St. Robert Bellarmine says the following: the Roman clergy, stripping Pope Liberius, went over to Felix. Felix began to be the true pontiff. For although Liberius was not a heretic, nevertheless, he was considered one on account of the peace that he made with the Aryans. And by that presumption, the pontificate could rightly be taken from him. For men are not bound or able to read hearts. But when they see that someone is a heretic by his external works, they judge him to be a heretic, pure and simple, and they condemn him as a heretic, end quote. I think that speaks to what we were just talking about there.
I didn't know St. Robert Bellarmine was a schismatic too. Oh my goodness! Now there was one on the best 25 minutes you'll never see because the tech glitches. We talked about the next quote of Thomas Aquinas. Do you want to bring that one up as well? Because that one was strong.
Sure. And I will try to edit that a little bit because it was a little lengthy, but let me see what we can do with that one. So St. Thomas, somewhere in the Summa, explains that the quote from St. Paul, where St. Paul says, though we or an angel from heaven preach a gospel to you besides or different than that which we have preached to you, let him be anathema, which means excommunication, accursed. And it seems to Thomas that he has to answer an objection to this, because how can Paul, for example, excommunicate Peter or Thomas or one of the other apostles, since they're all equals, or an angel, because an angel is superior to a mortal man? And so what Thomas writes here is that we must solve the objections which arise on this point. The first is that since an equal has no authority over his peers, and much less over his superiors, it seems that the apostle has no power to excommunicate the apostles, and that would include St. Peter, who are his peers, and of course St. Peter would be his superior, and less so the angels, who are superior. Therefore, Paul's anathema is actually invalid. But he answers, the answer to this is that the apostle passed this sentence not on his own authority, but on the authority of the gospel teaching, we could say the deposit of faith, that's what Thomas is talking about, of which Paul was the minister, and the authority of which teaches that whoever says anything contrary to it must, emphasis here, must be expelled and cast out. The word that I have spoken, the same shall judge him on the last day. And Pope Innocent III, who lived around roughly around the same time as Thomas, also said that he could be judged if he was a heretic. He said that the Pope cannot be judged except on that account. It's like the marriage between a man and a woman, where our Lord says, except on the count of porneia, that you cannot dissolve it. And Innocent III says that the porneia that we're talking about here, or the fornication we're talking about here, would be if the Pope was talking adult heresy or committing heresy. So you and I are not, standing on quicksand, or anybody else who brings up these quotes from someone of the stature of Thomas Aquinas or Pope Innocent III,
or Robert Bellarmine or Saint Columban, or these are big deal saints and theologians.
Exactly. And so I can only speak for myself, but I'm sure we're in the same boat here. Is I don't want to be different. I just want to follow what the great teachers said and did. And I'm not trying to be innovative here. I'm just trying to bring back a true ressourcement, right? a true getting back to what the scholastics and the fathers have said. In fact, that isn't that what the popes of the 19th century encouraged us to do, Leo XIII and Pius X.
Yes. Yeah. And I'm reading a biography right now of Thomas More, written by Chambers. It was published by Angelico. It came out in 1935, I think. It's a reprint. But it's interesting to read about that time because they were facing a similar, not a crisis of the papacy, but they were facing this notion that they actually, in all eras, theological discussion can get kind of stale or something. And they wanted to do what at the time they called humanism. Doesn't mean anything like humanism today. It basically means like a liberal arts education. And this is sort of the end of the golden era of scholasticism. This is 300 years or so after Aquinas. And they realized that they needed to start making sure everyone could read Greek and Latin fully and write in it and speak in it and all those sorts of things. And read the scriptures, funny enough, as if they were literally true and not just allegorically. Not to deny the allegorical meanings, but they sort of realized that basically they had to go back to the sources in the smart sense. And it's always good to go back to what your ancestors have said about things. When you want to know how to deal with something, you should ask your grandfather if he's around, and he'll probably tell you what his grandfather told him, and he'll have a lot to say. And that's a good thing. And again, one of the reasons why I think it's so vital for this conversation for Catholics is because a lot of people have a feeling in their gut. But of course, they're not professional theologians. They're not historians like yourself. So they don't have the time to sit there and go through 100 different books. They've got to commute and they've got day jobs and all this kind of stuff. So they have to rely on people to bring this information to them. This gives them something to say to themselves. Okay, I may disagree with some of, my family members or whatever, but I'm not crazy. My Catholic sense has something to it.
Our Lord says, my sheep know me. I know them. They won't follow a hireling. So it's our blessed Lord saying that right there. And as you point out, you can fool some of the people all the time, but you can't fool all the people all the time, right?
Yeah. That was the prophet Bob Marley, wasn't it? And yeah, that was one, or that was his. What was his second in command? What was his name? It wasn't. That was the Get Up, Stand Up song. What is the? What was his second guy? What was Bob Marley's assistant singer? I can't remember his name. Anyway,
I can only think of Eddie Murphy doing an impersonation of him, but
yeah, that was in that Get Up, Stand Up, Stand Up. Yeah, that song. Goodness gracious, I don't know why I know that, but anyway. Very good. But Bob, you didn't think, ladies and gentlemen, we got St. Columban, we got Bob Marley, we've got the whole gamut of theological opinion here. Okay, so what other quotes do you want to share with us?
Yeah, so this is probably this may be the most interesting one of the day. So let's get to it here. So this quote, let's set the context. 1943, I believe, Pius XII comes out with his encyclical on the mystical body of the Church. 1947, a very young Karl Rahner, still, I guess, Orthodox or somewhat Orthodox at that point, writes the following. Even those public heretics and schismatics, right, that's the key word here, is public, who either cannot be proved to be, or in fact are not in heresy or schism through formal sin, which we were talking about earlier, or subjective guilt, are outside the church. Okay, this is essentially what St. Robert Bellarmine, if I understand him correctly, was saying before in the quote we gave before. They do not belong to the visible church. And Rahner continues. It was the almost universal teaching of theologians even before 1943. And it follows from the very nature of things that even material heretics and schismatics do not belong as members to the visible church. For if those who are outside the church by a non-imputable, but nevertheless public and juridical act belong to the church, then the visible church could no longer be one in respect of her visibleness. And then he follows up with just a little bit more. If you want, I can read.
Sure.
And then he says, moreover, a bishop or pope, according to the universal teaching, keeps his ecclesiastical powers even if he is occultly unbelieving in the purely internal forum, right? I.e., in his heart, not public. But to the contrary, possession of ordinary ecclesiastical authority, that means being a bishop over a city or being a pope over the universal church, right? The possession of ordinary ecclesiastical authority and non-membership in the church for public material heresy are mutually exclusive notions. So that's from 1947.
That's Karl Rahner, eh?
And again, you can look up Ludwig Ott, Fundamentals of Catholic Theology. He says the same thing. Now, when you've got those two guys in agreement, you've got a pretty strong argument there. And I could add Sylvester Berry, all these pre-Vatican II, I'm sure you've read the manuals, right? These dogmatic manualists, they all seem to be in agreement on this point. So Archbishop Viganò seems to be on very strong ground. It's not he who is outside the church. It is the man who has allegedly pointed out that he is automatically excommunicated, who actually himself is outside the church, as it were, for apostasy.
I guess the real question is, what the heck happened to Karl Rahner?
That's true. Well, one could ask the same question about who's the seven-story mountain guy? Thomas Merton.
Thomas Merton, yeah.
And I love Archbishop Sheen, but he got a little softer around the edges after the council too, right? I guess it was hard to buck the trend, the zeitgeist at the time, right?
Yeah, that's true. It's amazing. Yeah, so, I mean, again, this is one of the reasons why I think Archbishop Lefebvre will be canonized one day, is, he said in plain terms, if I'm excommunicated from Freemasonry. People say, oh my goodness, you are saying that the church is not indefectible and you're such a schismatic and blah, 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 blah. And again, he's getting letters in 1975 or 6 from Cardinal Bonelli, who was otherwise a pretty good guy in many ways, and saying that, in order to go through with the ordinations, they have to basically profess their obeisance to the conciliar church. And Archbishop Lefebvre is saying, I don't belong to the conciliar church. I belong to the Catholic Church, And the crisis is a mystery. I mean, in many ways, Bishop Tissier spoke about this. I mean, it's very, what is the way out of this? I have no idea. I do know that it will be a return to tradition, but how that will happen in the concrete, step by step, I have no idea, and I don't think anybody does. Nonetheless, there is this mysterious warring between the church and the anti-church. There is this mysterious internal battle of a true church and a false church, both operating within the external auspices of the one church, and it is very mysterious and confusing.
It's the mystery of iniquity, right? And back in the 1940s, Archbishop Fulton Sheen talked about the ape of the church and how you could tell it from the real church. He gave the different notes, right, by which you could tell the real church from the false church. And another, who did it most recently? He's an African priest. Do you know who I'm thinking about?
Was it the priest who was in the Opus Dei who got kicked out, or was it a different one?
I think, yeah, he did too. Yeah. But I'll just, if you want, I'll read a quote here from what Archbishop Sheen had to say. He says, "This will be the mark of the ape of the church." Did I? Oh, you know what?
You have Cardinal Below on there.
Yeah, I need to pull up. Can I pull up a different window? Will that work?
Sure.
Or do we have to?
Well, why don't you just read it to us? Why don't you just, we don't have
Okay,
to pull it up. Just read it to us. I'll just have us on the
sure.
screen. You can just read it.
Okay. If there is no personal sin, then there is no judge. And if there is no judgment, then evil is good and good is evil. He, right, the Antichrist, will come disguised as the great humanitarian. He will write books on the new idea of God to suit the way people live, make men shrink in shame if their fellow men say they are not broad-minded and liberal. What's the expression? Rigid, I think, is the expression that gets thrown around, right? He will be so broad-minded as to identify tolerance with indifference to right and wrong, truth and error. He will foster more divorces under the guise that another partner is vital. He will invoke religion to destroy religion. He will not believe in God because his religion will be the brotherhood without the fatherhood of God. He will deceive even the elect, set up a counter church, which will be the ape of the church, because he, the devil, is the ape of God. All the notes and characteristics of the church, but in reverse and emptied of its divine content. A mystical body of the Antichrist that will, in all externals, resemble the mystical body of Christ. Bishop Sheen, tell me what you really think.
Yeah. I mean, that definitely sounds like what we're going through. It's masonry. It's, it's, as Father Fahey would say, it is organized naturalism. And
Yes.
it is, this won't get me censored because you can say these things, but some people will be annoyed with me. It is rabbinical Judaism with the, the covenant for Jews and then the Noahide laws for everybody else. It is, in many ways, Islam. People don't realize how ecumenical in ways Islam is in so many ways. It's Masonry. It's the French Revolution. It's conduct over creed. It doesn't matter what you believe. It just matters that you're a nice person, which is religious indifferentism and so forth. This organized naturalism really is the crux of our time.
Yeah, Father Benedict Rochelle, Lord rest his soul, was not a trad in any sense of the, well, not in most senses of the word.
Yeah.
But he used to get very upset. He said, "Our Lord did not say, 'Blessed are the nice.'"
Yeah. Yeah.
You won't find that anywhere in Scripture.
Yeah. Now we've been going, I mean, again, people are going to miss out on the best 20 minutes that they'll never see. But I think our two parts together here are going to be about an hour. Is there anything that you'd like to add before we sign off?
Oh, well, just on this topic, we have to pray for Archbishop Viganò. God will strengthen him and all those that are trying to do what's right, Bishop Strickland, Cardinal Burke. We have to pray for those who are teaching heresy and promoting heresy, Jorge Bergoglio. And the fact that we point them out doesn't mean that we do not love them. Okay? It's tough love, right? And so that should not be lost. Caritas is supernatural love for someone. You want to see their soul get saved.
Yeah.
Another plug for myself here. I've written a book on the subject of the Synodal Church, the Third Secret of Fatima and the Synodal Church, where this is volume 1, where I talk about the resignation of Benedict and other things. But a lot of the stuff that we talked about tonight is also in the book. EdmundMazza.com. I've got some great courses coming up and would love to have students.
Let me I'll actually bring up the website on the screen here, EdmundMazza.com. And so I can show people. And here it is. And I'll press share. Does that work? Boom. EdmundMazza.com. You can see there you have upcoming courses, Ancient World and so forth. I recommend everyone go there. You're not going to, come on, you're going to spend whatever, $50,000 to get a degree that teaches you nothing. Or you can go to Dr. Mazza's website and actually learn something for real. So check it out. Link for that in the description area. And I'll close by saying, ladies and gentlemen, as well, I do have stuff at my Substack. Actually, if you're listening to this on YouTube or on one of the major platforms on, iTunes or Spotify, it's been available for a few days for those who are already signed up. So there's a little perk. You can get stuff faster. Plus I have things that are just for subscribers. And so thank you to everybody who signed up there. And I guess last thing is to, Sorry. I'm terrible at self-promotion, Dr. Mazza. I'm going to Italy this fall with Father Albert Callio, and my wife's coming as well. It's a pilgrimage.
Wonderful.
You can find the link for that in the description area. There is no inexpensive trip to Italy because it is a transatlantic adventure, but it is a very good deal as far as trips to Italy go. But most importantly, we go to all these great holy sites, and it's a truly traditional Catholic pilgrimage. It's going to be amazing. And I thank you, Dr. Mazza, because when it comes to Archbishop Viganò and so forth, people need to know you're not crazy. You're not crazy if you say there's something fishy here, and I don't think this is valid. And there are strong reasons to say that Viganò has a point, and as well as traditionalists in general who just kind of won't go along with the strangeness of the springtime. And I do think God is going to be very merciful. I think God is going to be very merciful for us during these times, because last time I checked, when I read my Baltimore Catechism or the Catechism of Trent, it didn't say in order to be saved, you have to pass a canon law ecclesiology exam. I said you had to keep the faith. And so just trying to hold on to that is what's most important.
Amen, brother.
All right. Check out Dr. Mazza's website. Check out my stuff after you've signed up for his, and a host of other things you can find there. I will see you guys next time. This has been Mere Tradition, and God bless you all.